Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
Father, we do thank you for your grace and mercy to us. We come to you now, and we're looking to study the Word of God. We're looking to do it seriously, to listen to what you have to say to us, and to learn how to apply your Scripture in today's world. Father, we thank you for this book of 1 Corinthians. There is so much for us to learn, and we do pray for your guidance today. We look to you now in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we're returning to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And Paul has, you remember, in chapter 8, given us some general principles. And the general principle that applies to all of this, what's the main subject? Can we what? Can we eat food, meat sacrificed to idols? Not our contemporary problem, but that was the issue for them. In chapter 8, he gives us a general principle, and that general principle is what? We must be controlled by what, not what?
By law, not by knowledge.
By love. We must be controlled by love, not by knowledge. Knowledge tells us what? What does knowledge tell us? That we can eat. That an idol is nothing. That nothing contaminates the food itself when it is sacrificed to an idol. It is God's food. And so knowledge tells us that. But what does love tell us? What's the danger? You might cause a weaker brother who does not have the same kind of knowledge and understanding of spiritual things, you may cause him to stumble. And so love is going to say, I will not insist on my rights. So that's the principle that he gives you there in chapter 8. But in chapter 9, he gives you an illustration from his own life. Now look, here is an example in my own life where I have a right to something and I have not used it. I have a right to financial support, and yet I have not used it for your welfare. And so he talks about disciplining himself because he does not want to be disapproved by God as far as the final evaluation of his life. So he takes that statement that he disciplines himself in order not to be disapproved, and he uses an example in the beginning of chapter 10 from Israel, as they had many privileges and yet they failed during the wilderness wanderings and were disapproved by God. They were not able to enter into the promised land. So having given us all of this as the background leading up to the answer to the specific questions, can I eat meat offered to idols? He's now going to answer that question in 3 areas. First area, can I eat meat? What? As part of an idol feast. Can I go to the feast and eat meat with all of the other ones who are celebrating there? And what's his answer to that? No. That's not a matter of freedom. That's not a matter of liberty. That's not a matter of being lawful to me, because when you do that, he says you are having fellowship with the with that which is worshipped. And since behind these pagan gods, which are not real gods, behind them are demons. You have a kind of worship that is used by Satan to oppose God, and so these things are really sacrificed to demons. Now, the second issue, and he's going to bring up that issue in verses 23 to 26. What's the question there? Can I eat meat? What? Can I eat meat? From a pagan sacrifice, where? That's sold in the market. The meat has been sold in the market. Some of it has been sacrificed to idols. Some of it has not been sacrificed to idols. I don't know which. And so when I go down and buy meat there, I might be eating meat that is sacrificed. Can I do that? And Paul's answer is, yes, you can. That's where he is saying that this is God's meat, and they really, the pagans can't contaminate it by their sacrifices. Now the third question really looks at chapter 11 and verse 27, and we will include verse 1 of chapter, did I say chapter 11? Chapter 10 and verse 27 will include chapter 11 and verse 1. Now here's the third question, third specific question that comes out of this issue. Can I eat meat where? At a friend's house who has called me to dinner. He has called me to dinner. We are going to go to his house. We are going to eat there, and maybe part of that, maybe that meat has been sacrificed to idols. Now, what does Paul say? Now, notice he begins in verse 27. If one of the unbelievers invites you and you wish to go, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. Can I eat that meat? Yes. What does he say? Don't ask any questions. In other words, it is not necessary for you to search out the background and to go into the way that this food has been acquired and prepared. It's not really necessary for you to raise the issue. Now, why not? He's already told us. He's already told us. That has not contaminated the meat, even if it was sacrificed to idols. So as far as you are concerned, you don't really need to raise the issue, because that meat is not going to harm you. Now, verse 28 gives a qualification. But if anyone should say to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols. So here you have a person that comes up to you. Who is it? There's some discussion among the commentators. Who is this someone? Was it your pagan host or one of the pagans? Or was it a Christian that you might know that would be there, another Christian? In the context, I think it's more likely that this is a fellow Christian that he is talking about. It could even be a Jewish believer, because they would be more concerned about this issue, but it might have been new Christians who have, like the Thessalonians, turned to God from idols to serve the living and true. And so they're concerned about this. And what does Paul say? You're sitting there. You just think of this. You're sitting there. You're about to bite into a nice piece, juicy steak, medium rare, and you've got the fork, I don't know if they use fork, forks, but you've got the fork up to your mouth and somebody taps you and goes, hey, you know, that's been sacrificed to idols? Whew, I just got you in time. Now, what does Paul say? He says, do not eat. Do not eat. Now, wait a minute. Don't eat. But I've got a right to eat. This meat has really not been affected. It is good meat. What does Paul say? He says, do not eat it for two reasons. For two reasons. First of all, for the sake of the one who has informed you. This is a weaker brother. This is a weaker brother. And so, love, which is our general principle, love does not want to injure a weaker brother. So do not eat. And then, secondly, he says, without asking questions, and for conscience sake, in verse 28. Second reason, and for conscience sake. Now, when he says for conscience sake, he's not talking about your conscience. Your conscience tells you that it's okay to eat. But for the conscience of the other person. I mean not your own conscience, but the other man's. The other man's. Your freedom might cause him to follow you, and for him, it would be sin. Now, how could it be sin for him and not for you? How could it be sin for him and not for you? Because he feels guilty. Yes, but why does he feel guilty? Yes.
Because he's come out of a background where he sacrificed to pagan gods, or may have been a Jew as well.
Because of his background of sacrificing to pagan gods, or being a Jew. But when you look at his conscience, what is his conscience telling him? This is something you shouldn't do. Why? Because it's been sacrificed to idols, yes. But if you do it, what? In his mind, it's sin. It's sin. Is it sin? Not really. But he thinks it's sin. Now look, if you think that something is sin, even though it's not sin itself, and you deliberately go ahead and do that, what are you saying? You're saying, this is a sin against God, but I don't care. I'm still going to do it. And so to a person who thinks that it is sin, it is sin. And so when he says, don't do it for his conscience sake, he is saying you are trying to look out for the weaker brother. Your freedom might cause him to go ahead and follow you, and for him it is sin. Not because it is sin, but because he thinks that it is sin. Now, you notice in this passage, Paul never says that we need to alter our convictions. We are to know the truth. He does not say that we have to become a weaker brother. We know the truth. But we can alter our behavior in the presence of a weaker brother. Now, who is the weaker brother? The weaker brother in this passage is the person who is going to stumble and sin against his conscience because he follows you. The weaker brother is not somebody that is just going to criticize you and find fault with you. There are people who, what is he doing? I am shocked. I would never do something like that, and they just want to criticize. That's not what Paul is talking about here by the weaker brother. Now, he asks a question in verse 29, why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? Why is my freedom judged by somebody else's conscience? Now, what's his answer? Now let me say, if you can answer that question, you've really got it as far as what Paul is saying here. You have the heart of this passage. Why should my freedom be judged by another's conscience? Why?
Because everything should be done for the glory of God.
Everything should be done for the glory of God, and I do not want to hurt. I do not want to hurt spiritually another believer. I want to build him up. I don't want to tear him down as far as his spiritual life is concerned. Now, he is not saying that this person, there's no indication here that this person should be a perpetual weaker brother. You want to teach younger believers, immature believers, weaker believers. You want to teach them the principles of the Word of God so that they grow in their spiritual life and would not be stumbled by something like this. But your ultimate matter is concern is their welfare and not your rights. So he then goes and says, if I partake with thankfulness, why am I slandered concerning that for which I give thanks? Because of my love. Verse 31, whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do, this is the concluding principle. Whatever you do, whether you eat or whether you drink, what should you do? This is a great verse. Have you memorized it? Do all for the glory of God. Now, this is a broad principle. You can apply that principle to many areas of your life. I remember when I was a teenager in high school, I had just gotten saved. And that verse made me change my study habits. Because now I was not just studying to get grades or studying for the teachers or studying for my parents or anything like that. This is something that I needed to do for the glory of God. Whatever you do for the glory of God. And so whether it's eating meat, eating a meal, I'm going to do that for the glory of God. Whether it's my time, how am I going to spend my time, I want to do that for the glory of God. Whether it be the relationships I have, I want to do that for the glory of God. All should be done for the glory of God. That's the first general principle that he says, concluding principle. And then you also notice there's a second principle here in verses 32 and 33. Give no offense either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of the many, that they may be saved. What is the second principle? I do all for the glory of God. I do all for what? Verses 32 and 33. The benefit of others. The benefit of others. I do not want to cause anyone to stumble. You notice in verse 32, he says, give no offense to whom? Now, you notice he mentions three groups here: Jews, Gentiles, and then he mentions the church of God. Now, if you look back among the Jews, they divided the whole world into two groups, right? Jews and Gentiles. Paul says that when we have the church is a new thing. Those who are in Christ, those who are in the church, are not just Jews, not just Gentiles. They are a new entity. They are the church of God. We often speak about a person being a Jewish Christian or a Gentile Christian. Our real emphasis should not be on Jewish or Gentile. It should be on the word Christian. He is a Jewish Christian. He's a Gentile Christian, because that really makes us belong to a different category. We belong to Christ. And so there is a new thing here. And so I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of the many, that they may be saved. Paul is not what someone would call a man pleaser. He is saying that he did not compromise when it came to moral principles, but in those amoral areas, he is willing to make any sacrifice in order to reach any kind of man. So, verse 33, the chapter division here is probably not the best. Verse 1 should be really a conclusion of chapters 8 to 10. Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. Why do we say that should go with the previous chapters? What has he said in chapter 9? This is my example. I had the right to financial support. I did not use it. I become all things to all men. I am not seeking my own benefit. I am seeking the benefit of others. Be imitators of me. Be imitators of me. That's a dangerous thing to say, isn't it? There are a lot of people that say, imitate me, and they hold themselves up as the model and the paragon. Paul says this, but he qualifies it in a very important way. He says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. As I am of Christ. Are you a follower of men? Are you? There's an important sense in which you should not be a follower of men. The disciples of the Pharisees were followers of their teachers, their rabbis. At Corinth, you had the problem there in chapter 1. I am of Paul, I am of Cephas, I am of Apollos. They were followers of men in that sense. There is an important sense in which we should never be a follower of men. But recognize also that there are believers who are good examples for us. There are godly men and women whose lives reflect Christ, and we should follow them. There are people who will follow you. They will follow you. you may be their spiritual father or spiritual mother, if we would refer to it in that sense. But you're their spiritual parent. You led them to the Lord. You know what? They're going to follow you. They're going to adopt some basic views of the Christian life from what they see in you. They will learn what is expected in the Christian life by what they see in you. And what kind of example will you give them? If you are following Christ, then you're going to give them a godly example. And so that is the kind of thing that Paul is talking about here. Okay, we've come to the end of chapters 8 to 10. This is the issue of meat that has been sacrificed to idols. The Corinthians had questions about that. What Paul is talking about is a very specific thing that really applies to the Corinthians as far as the specific answer. But what he says in terms of the general principles has many applications to us in many different areas. There are areas of our society that for a new believer to get involved in, it would stumble them. And there are things that you may be able to handle that others can't. And most of the time we are self-centered and really don't care about others in all of these things. So are any questions on chapters 8 to 10? Okay, chapter 11. Chapter 11 has two issues. Actually, chapters 11 to 14 begin to deal with the church. And there are really three types of things that are dealt with. In chapters 12 to 14, he is going to deal with the subject of spiritual gifts. Chapters 12 to 14, he's going to be able to deal with the subject of spiritual gifts. And you notice how chapter 12 begins, now concerning. Now what does that phrase, now concerning, indicate? Do you remember it? Now concerning. Huh? Moves on to another topic, that's one thing. And if you look at chapter 7 and verse 1, do you remember? It begins with those words, now concerning, but it says, now concerning the things about which you wrote. So when he says now concerning, he's probably dealing with an issue, spiritual gifts that had been raised by the Corinthians. Now, the second half of chapter 11 deals with the Lord's Supper. Starts in verse 17, goes down to verse 34. And there were disorders at the Lord's Supper, and Paul says in verse 18, I hear, or when you come together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you. So, this is a matter that Paul had heard about from the people who had come from Corinth. So you have him answering church questions, spiritual gifts, 12 to 14. You have an issue about the Lord's Supper that people had informed Paul of. The third issue is the beginning of chapter 11, and that is the issue of women's head coverings. Now, what was the source of this issue, whether the Corinthians had written Paul about it or whether he had heard about it from others, we are not informed. It does not tell us. Now, I want to read these verses. Chapter 11, verses 2 to 16, the issue of women's head coverings. He says, now I praise you, because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and Christ is and God is the head of Christ. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. For she is one and the same with her whose head is shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but the woman for the man's sake. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman. And all things originate from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. Now, what is the issue at Corinth with these verses? What is the issue that Paul is addressing here? It's very clear, so we don't have a big thing here. What's the issue? Head coverings for women. Head coverings for women. And Paul is saying very clearly in these verses that women should have their head covered when they pray and prophesy. Now, for us, the issue is much more complicated. For us, the issue is the issue of application. As far as the interpretation of this passage, that is clear. Paul is saying that at Corinth, the women should have their head covered. Does that mean that women today in the church should have their head covered? See, that is where the application of what Paul says becomes much, much thornier. What we have here is an issue that has become a very hot issue in this passage. It's not just the head coverings. You have some things here that are very emotional issues. Paul says that the head of the woman is the man. And your feminists, your egalitarians look at that and they find that very upsetting, and so they deal with this passage in a way that will conform to their egalitarianism. Other people look at this and say, you know, if we do this literally, we're going to wind up dressing like the Amish, and we will look weird as far as the way we present ourselves to our society. So the interpretation of this passage is clear, but is what Paul's saying here in this passage meant to be a permanent kind of instruction that women should follow today, or is it meant to be an instruction that is applied in a temporary way, applied at Corinth in this way, and we would apply it today in a different way? So how do we read a passage like this? And how do we decide whether something like this, when Paul says that the women are to be covered, how do we decide if his instructions are culturally limited just for the time of the Corinthians? Now, let me say this. When we ask the question, is it cultural? You have very varied answers to that. Some people would say, as they look at Paul's instruction here, they would say that all we have in verses 2 to 16 is cultural. When it says that the head of the woman is the man, that women are to be in subjection to their husbands, they would say that's cultural. Women having the head covering, that is cultural. So some would say that the whole thing is cultural. Others would say the principle is valid, the principle is not cultural. That the women should be in subjection to the husbands, but that the head covering is cultural. In other words, they would say that the symbol is cultural, but the principle, what is symbolized by the head covering among the Corinthians, is intended to be permanent. So that's a second kind of position. A third position would be that both the symbol and what is symbolized are meant to be followed and practiced even today. So let me ask you to think about this question. We're going to ask a number of questions. Some of them are very important questions. Some will be less important questions as we go through the passage. I think that this is a passage most Christians today just sort of read over and don't think through very seriously. Sort of treat what Paul says here with the same kind of seriousness as greet one another with a holy kiss. Do you do that literally? Our South Americans do that literally, don't you? They do that. But most of our North Americans do not do that. Now, many people would treat the head covering just like the North Americans treat the holy kiss. Now, let me ask you, we have to be careful not to be just arbitrary and read a passage the way we want to read it. If we are going to say that what Paul is saying here is cultural, what do you need to show? What do you need to show? Well, think about it. What do you need to show if you say this is cultural?
Maybe that culture is very different from ours?
That the culture is different from ours? More specifically than that, yes. First century culture is very different from ours. But we say that a woman praying in worship with her head uncovered would be an offense in that culture. What do you have to show?
Show where he says in that culture.
You have to go back and do some historical research. You have to show that that really would be the cultural practice of that day. So that's part of it. Can you show that what Paul is saying here was really the cultural practice of the day? Now there's a second thing that you need to look at, and when Paul says that a woman should have her head covered when she prays or prophesies, why does he say that? What kind of arguments does he use? Does he use arguments like we saw in chapters 8 to 10, where he says, now I'm saying this not because this is a matter of right and wrong in itself, but I am saying this in order that you might not offend or cause anybody to stumble. Is that the kind of thing that he says? Or when he argues for it, are the reasons that he gives fundamental principles, fundamental theological, biblical reasons, not things which are based upon cultural? So was this the practice of the day, and are the arguments that he uses related to cultural kinds of arguments? Now I want to ask, what was the culture of that day? It's interesting that when you look at what Paul is saying here, he says, women, what? What does he say in this passage? What does he say? Women are to be covered, right? But that's not all he says. What about men? What does he say? Huh? They are not to be covered. They are not to be covered. What you do find is that Roman men, when they were going to worship, the Roman men would customarily walk bareheaded through the streets. But when they came into the temple and were offering up a sacrifice or a libation, what did they do? They pulled up they pulled the covering over their head. Roman men would have their head covered when they worshiped. So if you look at the Roman practice, what Paul is saying here is contrary to the Roman practice as far as the men, when he says that the men should be uncovered. It is also contrary to the Greek practice when he says that the women should be covered. Now, the Jewish practice is a little more difficult to pin down as far as the men are concerned. Have any of you been to a Jewish synagogue today in your life? Have you? What do you notice?
I went to one downtown. It was a few years back. I don't remember.
You went to one a few years back when you were younger and you don't remember. If you go to a synagogue, you will find that the Jewish men will have little caps on when they are in the synagogue. That cap is called a yarmulke. And so they're actually praying with their head covered. Now that's today. As far as the first century, it is a little bit more difficult to determine whether that was the practice in the first century. We know that it is taught in the Talmud in the 4th century that this was to be the practice of the Jewish men. But as far as the historical evidence, we can't push that back to the 1st century. But what do we see? You want to say that this is the cultural practice? Then show that this is what they did practice. Corinth was in Greece, and in Greece the women did not have their head covered when they prayed. Corinth was a Roman city. It had been rebuilt by the Romans after Rome conquered Greece, and in the Roman practice, the men had their head covered. The cultural argument is that what Paul is saying here, if you did not do this, would be an offense to the people of the day, and that's why he is arguing for that. So, first of all, was this the cultural practice of the day? It really doesn't appear to be. Then secondly, when we go through the passage, what kind of arguments does Paul use when he says women should have their head covered? Now, why? Now, what kind of arguments does he use? Now, notice in verses 2 to 6, what is his argument? Why should a woman have her head covered? What does he say? What's the key word there in these verses?
Because man is the head of Christ.
Man is the head of his wife or the woman. What you have here is the argument. Why should she be covered? Because the man is the head of the woman. That is basically a theological argument, isn't it? It's an argument based upon the theological principle of headship. Now look at verse 7. Verses 7, 8, and 9. He talks about here the man is the image and glory of God. The woman is the glory of man. The man does not originate from the woman, but woman from man. Man was not created for the woman's sake, but the woman for man's sake. Where's Paul getting these points? Genesis. He's going back to creation. He is going back to the Bible. And he is arguing from creation. Is that a cultural argument? No, it is a biblical argument from creation. And then look at what he says here in verse 10. The woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of... Why? Because of the angels. Now that's a puzzling verse. And we'll have to ask, what that means, and it is difficult to answer, but that's not a cultural argument. Whatever he means by saying because of the angel, that is not a cultural argument. Then you notice in verses 14 and 15, he says a woman should have a covering because of, what's the key word here? Because of nature. Nature. And we'll have to look at that. But what he is saying is that it is nature itself. He's not looking at nature in terms of custom. His fifth argument is in verse 16, and it is only in verse 16 that he refers to the practice of other churches. All of the arguments that Paul uses here are biblical and theological arguments, not cultural arguments. That's interesting. So we'll continue and we'll ask the question, what is Paul saying, and how is this meant to apply to us today?